The alarm went off at 5 a.m., but she had already been awake. The kind of awake that comes from a body too anxious to rest, from a mind that never truly closes its eyes. Outside, the city was still wrapped in the heavy quiet of dawn, but inside, that single borrowed room, everything was already moving. The air was cold, the blankets were thin. Her son, still only 3 years old, stirred lightly in the stroller where he now slept most nights, bundled in a patchwork of clothes, rather than real warmth. She watched him for a long second, his chest rising and falling, his tiny fingers clenched around the sleeve of her old sweater. Then she turned away. There was no time for silence, no time for stillness. She moved like someone who'd done this before, even though a part of her had hoped she wouldn't have to do it again. The papers were already stacked near the door. 10 printed resumes, copied on the cheapest paper she could find at the internet cafe 2 days ago. The formatting was crooked. The ink had smudged. But her name was there, her old experience at the bakery, her phone number, as if those things still held meaning when you were invisible. She folded them carefully, placed them into the side pocket of the diaper bag, then adjusted the bag under the stroller's handle. She grabbed a bottle of water, the last apple from the cupboard, and a handful of crackers that were already going stale. There was no milk for the child, no coffee for her. She didn't even pause to wonder how she would answer when he asked for breakfast. By 5:40 they were on the street, the sky still a dark blue, fading into gray. The stroller wheels clattered over broken sidewalks, and the sound echoed more than usual in the morning stillness. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and kept her eyes forward. The cold bit into her fingertips, not just the temperature, but the kind of chill that comes from facing the day without safety, without knowing where you're going or whether anyone will see you for what you are trying to be. A mother, a worker, someone who just needs a chance. Not a burden, not a question mark. The first job she aimed for was a bakery 10 blocks away. It opened early. She knew they might be receiving deliveries around 6:30, which meant someone would be there. Maybe the owner, maybe a manager, maybe someone who could look her in the eye and say yes instead of maybe. She didn't let herself imagine the yes. Not yet. All she knew was that she needed to get there before the line of men formed outside. Men without strollers. Men who didn't have to explain anything. She tried not to resent them. It wasn't their fault. But still, she envied their silence, their freedom to just be. The city was beginning to stir by the time she reached this bakery. She waited outside for 5 minutes, bouncing lightly on her heels to keep warm. Her son was still asleep, his cheeks pink from the wind. She touched his face gently, whispering words of comfort she didn't fully hear herself say. Then she stepped inside when the lights turned on, holding one of the resumes in her hand, like it was a passport, a ticket, a declaration of effort. The man behind the counter barely looked up. She introduced herself, spoke softly, explained that she had experience, that she could work mornings, that she lived nearby. She motioned toward the stroller, saying only that she was a mother, but that she had someone who could help her if needed. A lie she had to keep close, just in case it helped. The man glanced at the child, then back at the resume. "We're looking for someone a bit more available," he said. Not unkindly, not cruelly, just with that polite distance people use when they don't want to get involved. When they've already decided, she thanked him, nodded, turned around. Her fingers clenched the paper tighter as she walked out. That was one. 9 more to go. As she pushed the stroller back onto the sidewalk, the sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows between the buildings. The city was waking up now, fully. Buses roared past, office lights flickered on. The world was beginning its usual spin. And in the middle of it all, there she was, walking against it, through it, into it, one hand on the stroller, the other holding the creased edge of a printed hope. She had no idea what this day would cost her, only that she had already started paying for it with everything she had. By the time the morning rush had truly taken over the sidewalks, she had already visited 3 more places. A small cafe on the corner of an avenue, where the young girl behind the counter smiled kindly but said the hiring was already done for the month. A convenience store with fluorescent lights that buzzed louder than the voice of the man who simply said, "We're not looking right now," without even reaching for the paper in her hand, and a tiny print shop where the owner looked at her child before he even looked at her, then murmured something about the job being too demanding for someone with other responsibilities. She nodded each time. She thanked them each time. She left each place a little smaller than when she had entered. The city was getting warmer. Her scarf itched against the sweat gathering at the base of her neck, but she didn't take it off. Her shirt underneath had holes near the collar. She had chosen this outfit carefully. Plain, neat, forgettable. The kind that made you blend in, not stand out. But none of it seemed to matter. Not the clothes, not the resume, not the words she practiced in her head before stepping inside each place. The moment their eyes landed on the stroller, on the child peeking out with sleepy confusion, the conversation shifted. The tone changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply, but always in the same direction, away from possibility, away from her. At a clothing store just past a bus terminal, she finally tried something different. She left the stroller outside the door for a moment, under the awning, close enough that she could see it, but far enough that maybe the manager inside wouldn't notice right away. She stepped in and asked if they were hiring. Her voice was clear. Her posture was firm. For a few seconds, she felt almost ordinary, like any other woman trying to rebuild her life. The manager, a woman in her 40s, took the resume and began to read. There was a pause, a real pause, and then a soft nod. But the child began to cry outside, a soft, confused whimper at first, then louder. She turned her head instinctively. That was all it took. The manager's eyes followed her glance, saw the stroller, saw the reality. "You should be home with him," the woman said gently, but with that same finality. "He's still so small." She didn't respond, just reached for the resume and folded it back into her bag. She didn't try to explain, didn't say that there was no home in the way that woman imagined it. No husband, no warm kitchen, no stable fridge humming in the corner, just a borrowed room and a mattress on the floor. She didn't explain that being with her son was not a choice she was making, but the only condition she had left. Instead, she thanked her and left. The boy stopped crying as soon as she reached him. She knelt and touched his face, kissed his forehead, whispered that everything was fine, that they were just going to keep walking, and they did, from one street to the next, one business to another, one closed face to another turned back. By noon, her stack of resumes had shrunk to 4. Her feet were sore, her mouth dry. She hadn't eaten, and the child had only nibbled at a cracker, now crumbled across his lap. She took him into a public park for a few minutes, found a shaded bench, and let him stretch his legs. He tried to run, tripping over the uneven pavement, laughing despite the hunger that neither of them had acknowledged yet. She watched him and felt both a surge of love and a wave of guilt so large it nearly drowned her. What kind of childhood was this? What kind of mother brings her son to rejection after rejection beneath a sky too wide and indifferent to offer shelter? But she knew the answer. The kind of mother who doesn't have a choice. When he was tired again, she placed him back in the stroller and pressed the last of the water to his lips. Then they kept going. A bakery on a side street that was too crowded to hear her voice over the noise of orders and machines. A mechanic shop where the man behind the desk told her they didn't hire women. A tiny supermarket where the cashier looked at her, then at the manager, then back at her with sympathy that made her want to disappear. "We just don't have the space for someone who might need to step out," the manager said. "You understand, right?" She nodded. By the end of the afternoon, she had no resumes left. All 10 were gone. Not a single call promised, not a single glimmer of possibility offered, and yet the day still hadn't ended. The child was hungry. She was hungrier. The silence of those doors had followed her home, wrapped itself around her shoulders like a weight she couldn't shake. And still she walked, because what else was there to do except keep walking? The sun was at its highest. Point now, not gentle and warming, but sharp, pressing down like judgment. Heat radiated from the concrete, rising in waves that distorted the air ahead of her as if reality itself were bending under the weight. Her hands gripped the stroller more tightly now. The rubber wheels stuck slightly with every push, collecting dust, heat, and fatigue, as if they too were starting to resist the day. Her son had stopped speaking. He no longer pointed at cars or windows. He simply sat slumped to the side, his face pink, his eyes dull with the quiet exhaustion that children should never know. She had been walking for hours, not in circles, not aimlessly. Each step was directed, chosen, committed to a name or a rumor she had heard from someone weeks ago. Places that might be hiring, areas where labor was always needed. She had mapped it all out in her head days before, memorized the buses she could not afford to take, traced the routes in her mind, the way others might study a prayer. One of those stops was the industrial zone near the city's edge, where warehouses and cleaning companies filled long sun-bleached blocks. She had heard they hired day workers, that sometimes you didn't even need a resume, just a strong back and willingness. She didn't know if they meant women, too. She didn't ask. She simply went. The walk there took longer than she expected. The buildings gave way to broader roads, then thinner sidewalks. The farther she walked, the less the city looked like something meant for people to live in. Cars sped past without slowing. There were no benches, no shade, only trucks and noise, and the long stretch of nothing between her and the next gate. She stopped once, under a piece of scaffolding that cast a crooked shadow, and gave her son the rest of the crackers. She chewed a piece of apple for herself and swallowed before she tasted it, like a task more than a relief. When they arrived at the warehouse, she stood outside for several minutes before someone noticed her. A man in uniform, security badge, faded on his chest, walked over with a squint that suggested suspicion before sympathy. "You looking for someone?" he asked. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Cleaning? Stocking, anything. I'm available. I can start today." His eyes dropped to the child again, and the question hung there before he even voiced it. "Is there someone who can watch him?" She shook her head, said nothing else. "I'm sorry," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "We can't have kids here. It's not safe. Insurance doesn't allow it." She thanked him and turned away before he could offer any more apologies. She didn't need kindness. She needed work, and she was running out of places to look. From there, she walked to a stretch of mechanics and storage units, hoping to find someone working on the side who might take her on for a few hours of cleaning. She passed a car wash where men sprayed foam over tires and windshields, music blasting from a tinny speaker tied to a pole. She stopped at an auto shop and asked for the owner. The man behind the counter didn't even get up. "We've got no work for women here," he said, barely glancing up. "It's physical, heavy." "I can do heavy," she replied. "Not with a kid in a stroller, you can't." She left again. Her legs hurt in a way she hadn't felt since childbirth. Her back had begun to stiffen from the endless, hunched posture of pushing and bending and waiting. She wasn't sure how many hours had passed now. The light had shifted from blinding to golden, the shadow stretching again across the street like long arms pulling her backward. She walked another 3 kilometers toward a residential neighborhood where she had heard of a woman who hired part-time maids, hoping maybe there was something, anything. By then, her son had begun to whimper, not from pain, but from the kind of confusion that only comes when a child has been hungry for too long. When nothing makes sense anymore, and even the shape of the world starts to blur into need. She stopped at a small gas station and asked for water. The clerk gave her a cup, his expression unreadable. She didn't ask for more, didn't offer a story. She just sat outside under the narrow awning and let her son drink, drop by drop, as if rationing survival. A car pulled up behind her, music thumping low. She didn't turn to look. The sound of traffic had become background noise now, replaced by the louder, heavier silence inside her chest, the silence of options narrowing, of time running out. She whispered into her son's hair that it would be okay, that they would find something tomorrow. She didn't know if he understood. She didn't know if she believed it herself. But sometimes survival means speaking hope even when you don't feel it, offering comfort even when you have none to give. By the time they began the long walk back toward the borrowed room, the city looked different. Same streets, same faces, but she had changed. There was less in her now. Less hope, less energy, less paper in her bag. The resumes were gone, all 10 of them. No one had called, no one had said yes. And yet she kept walking, because tomorrow still existed, even if it looked just like today, even if it hurt, because her child needed her to keep walking. The light was almost gone by the time they returned. The streets, once busy and indifferent, had begun to quiet down, replaced by the distant rhythm of televisions through thin apartment walls and the occasional clang of a gate being locked for the night. She pushed the stroller up the final incline, with effort, the kind that comes from a body that has moved too far, too long, on too little. Her shoes were soaked through from stepping in gutter water hours ago, and the skin behind her heels had blistered and bled in silence. She didn't limp. She didn't complain. There was no one to see it, no one to ask if she was okay. Pain, in her world, had long since stopped being a signal. It was just part of the air she breathed. She reached the building and pulled open the metal door with her shoulder. It stuck slightly in the frame, the same way it always did, groaning like a thing that didn't want to be opened. The staircase smelled of damp cement and boiled food from another apartment. She carried her son in one arm, now half asleep against her chest, and lifted the stroller with the other, balancing everything as if by muscle memory. No one offered help. No one peeked out. She moved up the stairs like a ghost, the quiet sound of her breath, the only proof she was still here. The room was dark. She didn't turn on the light right away. She laid her son down gently on the mattress in the corner, then sank to her knees beside him. He stirred and opened his eyes, just enough to look around. His voice was small when he spoke. "Mommy, I'm hungry." She didn't answer at first. She stood up slowly and walked to the corner where the small bags of food had once been kept. A single plastic bag remained crumpled and nearly empty. She reached inside and found only the remnants of rice grains stuck to the bottom seam. No oil, no salt, no pot. Even if she boiled the rice, which she couldn't because there was no gas left, it wouldn't have been enough for him. She opened the cupboard anyway, knowing it was empty just for the sake of the motion. Sometimes pretending helps. She knelt beside him again and said softly, "We're going to eat in the morning, okay? We just need to rest tonight." It was a lie he didn't question. Children believe their mothers, especially when they are too tired to think. He closed his eyes again, curling up with the blanket she had wrapped around him that morning. She sat there a while longer, her knees pressing into the cold floor, her hands resting on her thighs, limp from the weight of not just the day, but the 100 before it. Her stomach twisted with its own protest. Hunger has a way of becoming louder at night. She drank a glass of water slowly, pretending it would fill something. It didn't. The room was too quiet. The kind of quiet that leaves you alone with your thoughts no matter how much you try to push them away. She thought about calling someone, but who? The people who had already said they couldn't help? The ones who answered with long silences and uncomfortable apologies? The ones who didn't answer at all? She had called them before, more than once, and the result had always been the same. Help that never came. Advice she couldn't afford to follow. Encouragement from people who would never trade places with her. She sat with her back against the wall and closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. Her mind ran in loops. How many places had she gone? How many resumes? 10. All gone, and still nothing. She began to wonder if maybe the problem was her. Maybe she looked too tired, too desperate. Maybe they could smell failure before she even spoke, or maybe it was the child. Not his fault, never his fault, but maybe just his presence was enough to turn possibility into burden. She hated that thought, hated herself for letting it cross her mind. He was the only good thing left in her life. He was the reason she kept waking up, the reason she kept walking. But still, she cried. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it came slowly, a few silent tears rolling down her face while she kept her eyes closed. The kind of crying that doesn't ask for comfort, that doesn't make sound because it doesn't expect anyone to listen. She cried into the fabric of her own sleeve so her child wouldn't hear. She cried like someone who had run out of plans, like someone who knew that tomorrow wouldn't be easier, just newer. The floor was cold. She hadn't noticed before, but now it was all she could feel. The cold pressing up through her skin, through her bones, reminding her of what it meant to be here, in this moment, in this life, with no job, no food, no help, and no choice but to try again tomorrow. She didn't make any promises to herself that night. She didn't whisper affirmations. She just sat there, awake in the dark, listening to her son breathe and waiting for the next morning to come, like she always did. Because even if she had nothing else, the morning would still come. And she would still be a mother. She rose again before the sun. Her body moved before her mind could form a reason. It was no longer about optimism or even necessity. It was a pattern carved so deeply into her that not waking up and moving forward would have felt like betrayal. She washed her face with cold water from a plastic basin, tied her hair with the same elastic she had used for 3 weeks, and dressed without a word. Her son stirred only slightly, curling tighter into the blanket as if he knew this day would be like the others. As if his small body had already learned the language of waiting. There were no more resumes. The last one had been handed over in silence at a pharmacy on the edge of the avenue, where the cashier had said they weren't looking. She had no money to print more, no bus fare to reach other parts of the city, no favors left to ask. Still, she folded the old diaper bag and prepared it as if it still held something. She looked at the torn corner of one crumpled resume left at the bottom of the bag. The edges were dirty, the ink fading where her fingers had gripped it too many times. But her name was still there, her phone number, her hope, fragile and exhausted, still breathed on that paper. She tucked the torn paper under her arm and lifted her son into the stroller. He was quieter than usual. He did not ask where they were going. Perhaps he already knew. It didn't matter. Outside, the air was gray with fog. The buildings looked softer, less sharp. She walked without a destination, retracing streets she had walked yesterday and the day before and the week before that. Every block held the memory of being turned away. Every glass door was a reflection of herself, thinner now, more hollow, but still moving, still asking. At the corner of a small neighborhood market she had visited before, she paused. She remembered the man who had glanced at her and said the shift was already filled. She had left quietly then, same as always. But something made her stop now. Not because she believed today would be different, but because she had nothing else left to try. She stood at the entrance for a long moment, trying to smooth the torn edge of the paper. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything they had carried. She looked down at her son. His eyes were half closed, his arms limp at his sides. She stepped toward the entrance. Before she could speak, a voice came from behind her. "You came by here yesterday, didn't you?" She turned. A woman stood behind her, holding a box of inventory, her apron dusted with flour and dust. Her face was round, kind but tired. The way all working people look when they've seen too much of the world to pretend. The woman tilted her head, not unkindly. "I remember your eyes," she said. "You didn't say much." The mother nodded slowly. She felt the sudden tightness of shame rise in her throat, but the woman kept talking. "I told the manager you came. He asked about you this morning. He doesn't usually, but he said something about the way you looked at the door, like you were waiting for it to open." She couldn't speak. She just held out the torn resume. The woman took it gently, without flinching at the crease or the smudge. She glanced at it, nodded, then opened the door for her. "Come inside. He wants to talk to you." It was not a promise, not a contract, not a solution, but it was something. A moment where the silence broke. A moment where someone remembered her, not because of the child she carried, but because of the way she had stood still, quietly, respectfully, waiting to be seen. She stepped inside, holding her son close. The air was warm. The smell of bread lingered in the air. The floor was worn, but clean. A man stepped from the back office and met her eyes, not with pity, but with attention, real attention. The kind that makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, you are not invisible. He asked a few questions. Where she had worked, what she could do, she answered quietly. Honestly, she didn't try to impress. She didn't need to. At the end, he said only this: "I can't promise a full-time position, but we need help with mornings starting tomorrow. If you can come in, we'll try it." She nodded. She couldn't speak. Not out of disbelief, but because her chest had gone tight with a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in days. Relief. Not the kind that bursts with celebration, but the slow, heavy kind that makes your legs weak and your hands unsteady when... She stepped back outside. The sun had risen a little higher. Her son rested his head against her shoulder. He didn't ask for food this time, but she whispered into his ear anyway, just loud enough for him to hear. "We'll eat tomorrow, I promise." And for the first time in days, she believed it. There are thousands of mothers like her. Different streets, different struggles, but the same quiet strength. The world may not notice them, but here we tell their stories. If this one moved you, stay with us. Another story is coming, and it deserves to be heard too.